coming to our last seminar series talk of the semester. I guess I will introduce myself. I'm Dr. Kimberly Munro, and this talk is titled Legends of the Hidden Temples, Ancestors, Saints, and Religious Landscapes in the Ancient Andes. So for those of you who don't know, I'm an archaeologist, and my research area is in the central Andes, so in Peru. And the reason why I titled this talk, Legends of the Hidden Temple, is because often when I introduce myself and people find out I'm an archaeologist, I often get the Indiana Jones comparison. And so this whole like, oh, do you dig ancient temples? And actually, yes, I do. It's sometimes my response. But I wanted to showcase Indy because he's brought up so much, and this is, when you think of an archaeologist, is this where your mind usually goes? Yeah, it's okay, there's no shame in it, because I bet it doesn't go to any of these guys. And these are actually who Indiana Jones was modeled after, so I just want to pay homage to the late great archaeologist, specifically Junius Byrd, so you can see his sweet fedora. There are similarities between Indy and Junius. But Junius Byrd was an Andean archaeologist, and he worked in in central Peru, and actually the region I work. And he worked in the same time period I work in, the late pre-ceramic. So he's one of my personal favorite mentors or idols, Junius Byrd. And then we have Hiram Bingham, also a Peruvian archaeologist, and he's known for discovering Machu Picchu. And then the third archaeologist that Indiana Jones is modeled after is Sylvanus Griswold Morley. He's actually a Mayanist. He worked in Central America, but these three culminated together to give you the archaeologist you all know and love today as Indiana Jones. When I was growing up, there was a TV show on Nickelodeon called Legends of the Hidden Temple, and I know anyone in my age set, my generation, might remember this TV show. It was a game show where they had to crawl through this ancient temple, and these Mayan guards would come out and scare them and try and keep them from whatever the task was that they had to discover. I don't even remember the premise of the show. I just remember there was all this lore associated with these ancient temples, and this guy would kind of spit out riddles, and they had to solve these puzzles and stuff. And so I wanted to tie it back to the work that I do in Peru, because there are hidden temples, and there are ancient lores associated with a lot of these hidden temples. And so when you think of archaeological sites, you often think about them as these ancient things lost in mystery, right? You don't think about the people who still live in these communities today that have a lot of these myths, these legends, these oral histories about the places that they still live and work in. And so when I was doing my dissertation work, I wanted to look at not only the ancient sites themselves, the excavations of these ancient sites, but also how the modern day communities, the modern day indigenous people kind of interact with their ancient landscapes, and how these stories kind of create the histories of these sites and our perceptions of them. So this is actually a site in central Peru. It's known as Chavin de Huantar, and it's located in the highland Andes. And this is actually the temple that the Temple of Doom was modeled after in Indiana Jones. So it's a 3-story high multi-platform temple, but it actually has these underground galleries, this labyrinth, this whole maze system that exists under the main temple structure. And as you're going through this maze, this labyrinth, what you come across is this guy. He's known as the Oracle of Chavin. He's a huge 6-meter tall granite sculpture that's sculpted as the staff god. And so you're kind of, obviously, as you're underground in this temple, you're hallucinating on San Pedro. It's really dark, it's really scary. There's a lot of sounds, music going on, and then you come across the god of Chavin. And so this is actually the inspiration for the Temple of Doom is these underground labyrinths. So that's my segue into South America and the region of Peru that I work in. I work pretty close regionally and time period wise to Chavin de Huantar, and there are a lot of similarities to the site that I work at and Chavin. So for those of you who don't know, Peru is located in South America. Here's just a basic map about it, and then this is the region where I work. So I work in Ancash, the Department of Ancash, in the Nepena River Valley. And this area highlighted in green is where I conduct my field research. So when I started my dissertation work, I surveyed all this area in green, just walking around documenting all of these sites in the upper valley. And why I was interested in the Nepena Valley is because, and there's my dissertation site right there is Cosma, where I focus most of my research. But the reason why I picked the Nepena Valley is because historically, it had, archaeologists had worked here previously in the past, and we knew a lot about the lower Nepena Valley by the coast, and we knew a lot about what was going on in the highlands here. My next map will actually show you the highland sites. But no archaeologist had documented this area in here, and so we really didn't know what was going on in the upper Nepena River Valley. And I was interested in filling in this gap of data, this gap of research, to figure out what kind of sites we had, where did they date to, and how many of them there were. So I really wanted to pinpoint and document what was going on in the upper valley, because no researcher had ever been up there. So this is what we knew for the lower valley. We knew we had these religious complexes down along the coast. These murals here are very similar to the iconography that's found at Chavin de Huantar. There's a giant cat god in a stairway that dates to the late pre-ceramic period and formative period. So we're looking at like 3000 BC. These walls as well. And my advisor was working at this site on the coast, so it just made sense that I would go to the upper valley and be close enough to my advisor where if I needed help or advice or logistical help, he was a few hours away, but far enough away where I could do what I wanted and kind of ignore his advice as I wanted, which I did regularly. This is the highland region that we knew quite a bit about as well. I had previously worked at this site at Hualcayan at a temple site there. And so if you look at this map here, this is the upper part of the Nepena Valley. This is that gap where we didn't know what was going on. We didn't have any archaeological research in this area. So we knew it was going on the coast, we knew it was going on in the highlands, but this was kind of a blank data set that nobody had gone to and visited. So how I started my research before I went out into the field is I took all the old maps and I brought them into GIS, and I kind of plotted them in GIS on satellite imagery, and then I looked at where there were no purple stars, and I knew that that's where we needed to fill in the gaps, right? So I focused on this upper area known as the Caceres district. I did some slope modeling as well based on topography to see where theoretically you would expect sites to be if you were looking at highland coastal interactions. So this is a topo map of the least cost path. So if people were walking in between the highlands and the coast, these are the most accessible areas. And these lines in red and these lines in yellow are actually the ancient Inca network system that went through, that was documented through the Nepena Valley and the Cosma Valley. And so we know the Inca were in this area because we have remnants of their old network. So who knows who the Inca were? Okay, a couple of you. So the Inca were the state empire that was occupying and running most of South America by the time the Spanish arrived. So they came into power about 1250 AD. And then, 1300 AD, and then they were in power. They were who the Spanish conquered when the Spanish arrived. And so we knew we had a prehistoric network running through the Nepena Valley. And when I started my research, I really wanted to focus on this coal cap area because we knew we had an Inca road system. We knew that's where the easier pass system was. And what I found when I did my survey was that's not where most of these complex sites were. They were actually located here in the Cosma basin. You can see there's a lot more orange triangles here. That's where I documented a lot of sites that hadn't previously been documented. So for my dissertation, I surveyed these three branches of the upper Nepena River Valley, the Rayan branch, the Kolkep branch, and the Cosma branch. I walked over 150 miles, a total of 4 weeks through this highland region. I went and visited 36 sites, 18 of them had not been recorded previously. And then I chose to focus on this area, the Cosma area, because of the number of sites that were documented there, but also just the complexity of them. So this photo here shows is a photo of the actual Cosma complex where I did my dissertation work. And you can see here there's two large temple structures, two large mounds. So this is the Oxybucoto mound and the Karakoto mound, and this is where I chose to do most of the excavations. The site itself is multifaceted, so there's actually a ton going on in this area. You can see these are the two mounds here, but all along these ridge lines, there's sites. There's activity, there's monuments, there's tombs, all going on here. And then this is the modern day community. So they actually live in and among most of the archaeological elements of the site. The modern day community itself was founded in 1714 with the Spanish occupation, so there's an old colonial roadway that runs through the town. Nowadays it's 80 people that live in this village, and they're agro-pastoralists that live in the community today. But this is the historic plaza of the town. And it's about a 15-minute walk from the main mountain complex at the site. So here's another image of all the archaeological elements at the site. You can see here, this is the road into town. There's no public transportation There's no public transportation into the Cosma complex. You have to take one of the supply trucks into town that goes up about twice a week. And then these smaller roads are the actual footpaths that most people walk to and from parts of the site. They don't really use a lot of car transportation. Okay, so I chose to focus on the two temple structures of the site for excavation's sake because I was really interested in these religious elements of the site and their relation to that temple, Chavin de Huantar, and if we had any Chavin elements here in the Cosma Basin. And so the two main mounds are known as Oxybucoto and Karakoto in Quechua. And at Oxybucoto, we actually found something that was pretty surprising. I was really looking for this Chavin occupation at the site, but what I ended up finding was much older than that. So the second year at the site, we excavated this full circular room. It's about 6 meters in diameter, and this is what it looks like obliquely. So it's actually a hidden temple. We found this temple structure that actually dates to the late pre-ceramic period. So this is a 5,000-year-old temple. And one of the ways we know it was a temple is not just because of the architecture, but because of how it was buried. It was left completely clean. We didn't find a single artifact in this room except for one spondylus shell. So they had ritually cleaned out this room. They had made sure the floors were impeccable. And then they had ritually sealed it with a lot of sterile rock fill, and then they sealed it with another 3 feet capping of sun-dried clay. So this room to dig out, it took us 2 weeks with like 8 field workers and 2 archaeologists to actually excavate all of this sterile fill. And it's pretty, these are some of our workers. They're actually local community members. When we started digging this out, they were super excited because they thought that at the bottom was going to be like a gold tomb or something, like they were sealing off something really extravagant. Like, why would anyone put this much work and effort into closing off a room if it wasn't something they really wanted to hide? So we got to the bottom of the room and there was one spondylus shell. And I was like screaming because I knew we had a Katash temple. I was like, oh my God, look at this architecture. We have a central hearth, we have niches, we have, we have like a stairway leading into it. So these are the niches there. And I was just like, this is a perfect Katash temple room. This is something highland related. Like, we have a highland site in a coastal valley and we know it dates to the late pre-ceramic period. So I'm just screaming. And the workers were like, there's no gold, there's no silver, there's no copper. Like, we dug for 2 weeks to find dirt. And I'm like, but look at all this architecture. They were pretty mad at me that day, and I was in literal heaven. So this is what the room looks like obliquely. There you can see our spondylus shell. And what's interesting about spondylus is that it comes from the warm waters of Ecuador. It does not come from the cold waters of Peru. So 5,000 years ago, we know that there was an interaction exchange network, religious network, that was bringing shells from Ecuador to, this site is 60 kilometers inland. So not only are they bringing things down the coast, but they're also trading them inland into the upper valley, which is pretty significant to know that you have this long-reaching of an exchange network from the highlands to the coast between Peru and Ecuador at this time. This is an artistic, one of our field school students is an artist, and they actually drew this. It's our project logo, and it's just a pretty cool reconstruction of what the temple would look like with a fire in the central fire feature. This is the retainment wall for that room, and just so you can see the scale of it, this is a colleague of mine from the University of Merced, and she's standing in our excavation unit, and you can just see the outside of this fill here. And not only did we recover that room, the circular room, but we also uncovered 6 other structures, all dating to the late pre-ceramic period. Here you can see the clean floor of another one of these rooms. And so this fill level here is actually the back side of that circular structure, but underneath we have another circular room. So we know that the AC1 temple chamber dates to 2950 BCE, so 5,000 years ago, and this is underneath that. So we could possibly have late pre-ceramic architecture that's even older than that room. And the outside of this wall is much cruder as well, so it's pretty likely that it is older than what we uncovered. So at the same time we were digging at the Axipacoto mound, half of our crew was at the Querecoto mound, and this is the larger structure in the basin. So you can see here, none of this is natural. This is all built up. So this platform here is 240 meters north-south, and then it's 18 meters high. So this is all man-made, and we found out that it was all man-made in the late pre-ceramic period. So we have a very big late pre-ceramic structure in this upper valley region. So here are the 2 mounds in relation to each other, and the Cosma River runs through them. It's about 15-minute walk between the 2 mounds. So we did find late pre-ceramic architecture at Querecoto Mound, but to dig through it, we had to go through these early horizon levels. And we actually, this late pre-ceramic architecture was about 500 years later than what we found at Querecoto, or at Axipacoto with the AC temple structure. And we found out that they weren't being as clean as they were at the other mound. We found quite a bit of ash pits, projectile points, some work bone pendants. This was a soapstone llama head bead, and then a blade that had been left in an ash pit. So they were a little messier than the people who were occupying the other mound. There was just a lot more going on here that we could dig through, as well as a ton of burned deer bones that we were finding in these ash pits. But to get to the late pre-ceramic levels, you can see here, this is the late pre-ceramic area. We actually had to dig through an early horizon occupation. And this early horizon is what dates to that Chavin period, that temple of doom I was showing you at the beginning of the talk. So what was interesting about our early horizon occupation is we found this clean clay floor that had been prepared. We found these very large ceramic vessels, and we found a ton of offerings. And the offerings took form of lots of broken ceramics, lots of llama bones, guinea pig bones, spindle whorls, panpipes, flutes, and we found 10 infants, perionates, and fetuses. And so all the burials we found in this mound were strictly infants and fetuses. So that says something about this area, right? Why would you bring only infants to a site? What does that say about the people that were bringing things to this area, right? So this was a late pre-ceramic temple, and then later on people were coming to bring just their infants and miscarriages. A lot of these dated to about 40 weeks, so we believe that they were most likely miscarriages. So you can see here, these are the burials. And the interesting thing about all the burials was we were finding different burial styles. And so the infants, a lot of them were secondary, which means that they had previously been buried somewhere else, and then they were brought here because they were bundle burials. So people were coming specifically to this site from other parts of the valley to leave their infants as offering to this mound. These are an example of the ceramics that were found. These circle and dot ceramics are related to that Chavin culture, that Chavin religious occupation. Here's a little ceramic face. And all of the ceramic bowls that were found, aside from the very large ones, were these little hand bowls. So they were most likely utilized as single-use serving bowls, and then they were actually smashed and left with the rest of the offerings. So people were coming here, drinking, feasting, and then smashing their bowls and leaving behind ritual items. We found snuff, bone spatula snuff, so they were most likely doing hallucinogens as well, shells, some bone beads, and bone awls, as well as spindle whorls. Does anyone know what a spindle whorl is? Anna does, right? Do you want to explain it? You probably can explain it better than I can.
I tried. So the little round disc sits at the bottom of a pole, and it's like a little stick, and it's a weight, like a counterweight. And so you spin the yarn up onto this pole, and then that's the weight that kind of holds it as it spins. So you can make yarn. Is that?
Yep. Yeah. So it's the weight to pull down to make an individual thread of yarn, and so that's when they call it a spindle whorl because it spins as you're pulling the weight down. And so we found a ton of these. So they were leaving musical instruments, stone blades, panpipe fragments. We have no idea what this was. We found 2 of them. They were just these flat, like iPad tablets made of stone that were left 2,000 years ago, and then the spindle whorls. But one of the really interesting things is we found we uncovered these 2 ceramic pots. And if you can see here, this is a ceramic pot, and this is my co-director, Hasten, and he's measuring the pot, and it looks like a hot tub, right? Like that is a huge, huge pot. It measures, this one was 2 meters in diameter, so 6 feet. This one was 3, and this is the one where we found 3 of the infants inside. So why would you need a pot this big? Who's ever been to a keg party? That's why you need a pot this big. These vessels were utilized for fermenting and storing chicha beer. Chicha beer is corn beer, and so we know today they still use this technology to ferment chicha. They actually bury them half in the ground to keep it cool while it's fermenting, and we've found other examples of these fermented these kegs basically for drinking beer. Also at the site, we found several of these above ground tombs, so these chulpa structures where they had open access to their burials, to their ancestors. Most of them are looted today, but they basically would put their revered ancestors in these above ground tombs and then go throughout the year to visit them, leave them offerings, drink beer with them, ask their advice. The ancestors in the Andes are still very much a daily part of life for Indian peoples. And then the other place where I put excavation units was up on the ridgetop, looking at the domestic areas of the site. So we had some walls that you could see. This is that late pre-ceramic mound, the first one I showed you, and it's about a 15-minute hike up the hill to the domestic area. We found curved walls and then domestic ceramics. But all of these ceramics dated later, so they dated to the early intermediate period, which is about 200 to 700 AD, and then the late Horizon period, which is late intermediate period, which is about 1000 AD. So and that's where our carbon dates dated to. So the domestic area dated much later than than the religious structures. There were also a significant amount of Huanca stones. Huanca stones are sacred markers in the Andes where they try to mark like places of emergence or where somebody important had died or been born. And then this is the Inca component at the site, and these are these huge granite carved boulders that were used in water rites, water rituals for the Inca. They're at basically the crest of the top of the mountain where the natural springs actually come out. So we know they were associated with Inca water rites, associated with the formation of the river and fertility. So you can see here, this is one of those boulders, and then it has like the little rivulets that we think might be kind of a map of the local landscape where they're showcasing how the water flows. From the carbon dates from excavations, we know that these were the peak use periods at the site based on our absolute dates. So a very large late pre-ceramic period component with those temple mounds from 3000 to 1800 BCE. Initial period, we had one date dating to that period, which is basically the start of that Chavin kind of religious complex, that Chavin cult, 1800 to 900 BCE. Then the early horizon, this was associated with the infant burials in those giant pots. And then the end of the early intermediate period and middle horizon is where we found some intrusive burials, as well as those chulpa, those above ground tomb structures, and the domestic area. And then the late intermediate and colonial as well. So this is what the mound looks like today. You can see there's our excavation tent blowing away in the wind, and an alfalfa field, and this is Nati. She's one of the local community members milking her cow. And so people today very much so interact with their local landscape, and they're still very much a part of the mounds. They have a lot of lores and legends associated with these mounds, how you can act with them. I wasn't even allowed to dig at the site until I asked permission to dig from the mound. We had to do a pago. A pago is a payment, and so we had to give offerings to the mounds first. Everyone who dug at the site had to give an offering and be part of the pago ceremony before they were allowed to dig. And then the Cosma leaders, community leaders, and religious leaders came out, and we smoked tobacco, and they looked to see which way the wind was blowing, the smoke was blowing, and the smoke blew towards the mound, which was her giving us permission to dig there. She wanted us there. The ancestor said we could dig. And so every year we basically have to come back and do this same ritual and be like, hey, is it still okay for me to be here? And so far she said yes, so that's a good thing. I try to keep Karakoto happy because she's a good mound. So these are just some photos of the modern day community that the community members have taken. There's actually a spindle whorl right there. That's Vicenta, she was weaving. And so they're an agro-pastoral community, and they still live very much the same way they have for hundreds of years. They make their own bread. They're known for their cheeses. There's Consuelo, she's actually making cheese. And their daily life is very much involved with the outdoors and the community on the mounds as well. So while I was there, not only was I excavating the site, but I was also collecting a lot of oral histories and lores, the history of the complex historically, going through historical records and accounts, as well as interviewing people. So they have a lot of legends associated with the mounds. As I mentioned, I had to ask permission to dig at the site, but Kerakoto is seen as a female mound. Some places in the Andes, they have male mounds. They're very personified. And so all of these religious sites actually have their own personalities. They're not things, they're beings. And they can control what happens to you. So you have to interact with them in certain ways. If I visit the site and I haven't visited the mound within a couple of days, the community members start to get pretty mad at me, and they're like, if you don't go see her, she's going to be mad and like cause an earthquake, you know. So you have to actually like pay homage to a lot of the elements at these sites. San Lorenzo is the community's patron saint. He's very important to the community members, and he also has the power to punish or harm you as well. There's legends about giant snakes that live under the mound, that you can't go at night or you can't go alone because the pit of snakes will eat you. There's a giant demon llama that comes out in the mist if you're out at night, so you have to stay away from the mound alone at night. I gave the example of the waka and the smoke. And the people in Cosma have lived there basically undisturbed for for thousands of years. Other areas of Peru are very much affected by the hacienda system or reducciones, which were like the Native American reservations here. But the people in Cosma were actually never touched by that. There's a hacienda down lower in the valley, but the Cosmeños were able to actually buy the land in the 1700s, and so they were able to kind of stave off their own being owned by the Spanish. There's legends behind that. They say that the Inca had left gold for them, and that's how they purchased the community of Cosma. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. But somehow they had the money to actually buy the land, and they're one of the few communities that have not been affected by the hacienda system. So they have these legends of how they got their name. The community is named Cosma, but they say it comes from the word kushma, which is the Inca word for shirt. That the peasants would wear, and they say that when the Spanish came, they called the place Kushma because there were so many Indians in these kushmas that's how the town got its name. So a lot of what I did is looking at syncretism, the ancient elements of the site, as well as the modern day community, and how these indigenous elements are mixed into the Catholic elements once the Spanish came. So if you see, this is the actual church in Cosma. It's a very small church, but if you look, this is the central point of the church, and who do you see here? It's not Jesus. Usually when you walk into a church, you see a crucifix, right? Or you see Jesus on the cross. This is San Lorenzo. He's their patron saint. He is the lawgiver of Cosma. He is who punishes and who blesses. And so they have a huge annual Saints Festival for him every year. They'll take him out of his niche and wash him, bathe him, clean him. And a lot of this has to do with the ancient elements of ancestor worship in the Andes, where they would actually take out their mummies and clean them throughout the year, change their clothes, make sure that they're happy. And so there are these elements, these relics that are left behind from the past that are now it's just replaced by San Lorenzo, their patron saint. So these are just some videos that I probably can't get to play of them bathing San Lorenzo during the festival. They parade him through town, but it all goes back to these Inca and indigenous traditions of ancestor and mummy worship in the past. These are the indigenous dancers, the danzantes, that come in for the festival as well, and they actually will dance through. Let me see if this will play. Dance, and through their dancing they give blessings to these ancient mounds as well. So this is the Oxypocoto mound. This was a prehistoric plaza that was associated with the mound, but now there are soccer fields, and these are you can't hear the sound, but it's a pretty cool song. Yeah, so that's about it. I have time for questions, obviously. There's a lot I just covered 5,000 years, so yes, Warren.
I have a really dumb question that I've never asked anybody until this moment. And that is, how do you know when you're to the base of whatever it is you're digging in? Seriously, because I always think, how do you just not keep digging? It looks like just dirt.
Yeah, so you either hit bedrock, which I like these, so the mounds here, we've never hit sterile. We've always just run out of time and money. So this mound is 18 meters high. We've only gone down 3 meters in all of our excavations because there's just so much architecture and so many things to do.
Some of those early pictures, though, it looked like there was actually floor in some of them, but then others that are...
Yeah, so those are actually prepared floors. So they actually made these clay. So we're not digging through. So this is the floor. This is associated with someone's patio from a house. Yeah, this is a floor. That's a late pre-ceramic floor. That's an initial period floor. Like these are all prepared floors. It's not like alluvium deposits or bedrock. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just didn't. So it's kind of different from site to site.
Yeah, and it depends on the type of site. And so typically it's when you hit sterile, so when you stop finding any cultural materials like artifacts. But when you're in the late pre-ceramic, and they're purposely leaving artifacts out of their fill. Yeah. Yes?
So is there any evidence that they built on top of earlier
Yes.
structures?
Yeah, so that's exactly what they would do here. So this room is underneath this room, and then this room is underneath. So there's a floor there that's broken. They built that on top of that. So that's how the mounds would get built up. They didn't build all 18 meters at a time. So it started as a lower structure, just like maybe one level. And then as they sealed it off, they built on top of it and built on top of it. So all of these fill layers, like that's a different platform. So that would be a different occupation level. That's a different occupation level. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Now, is there any evidence, like in that one that you just showed, that there's something below that one?
Below,
Keep going. Going the wrong way.
I'm going the wrong way. Yeah.
There.
This one.
Is there any evidence there's anything below that?
I would say so, because if you look here, where's a good one? So if you look here, this is that circular room. The other circular room is here. That's about where we hit that was 4 meters deep. This mound is 10 meters. We've gone down 4.
So more than likely this.
Yeah, because you can't see it in this photo, but there's actually, if you look at the aerial view and the drone view, you can actually see these like rivulets where there's most likely other architecture that's even beneath the soccer field. Yes, yeah, that's like $100,000 project. Yeah, that would take a lot of funding to get through all those layers. Yeah. Yes.
Dr. Munro, you mentioned that there were shells that you found from the Labrador oil sites. And given the architecture, and these are very specific designs, so you find much continuity of religious rituals or religious sites throughout the Andes region, or it was very concentrated in this one?
Yeah. So. The Chavin temple that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk is given credit for being like the mother culture. Like they always say the Olmec was the mother culture of Central America. They used to refer to the Chavin as the mother culture of the Peruvian Andes because it was a pan-Andean religion. And so a lot of the foundations of Andean cosmology and religion kind of starts with Chavin. But actually, it starts earlier than that because a lot of these Chavin sites are built on top of these Katash sites. So that circular room that I was showing you is a Katash structure. It's a late pre-ceramic Katash structure. And we've only really excavated, all archaeologists combined have only really excavated 7 of these Katash structures. Adding Cosma to this database of Katash expands what we know because most of the Katash structures have been excavated in this region, and now we have one here at the headwaters of the coastal river. So we know that the Katash religious tradition was far more expansive than we previously thought, and then Chavin kind of came and built on top of that pre-existing religious network. Does that make sense? Okay, yeah. So that's my hypothesis, is that Chavin took over Katash through ideology, but yes.
You said you also talked about how much Inca influence have you found? I would think that would be the very top of the excavation.
Yeah, so there's not a ton, which is what's interesting because all the archaeologists that work in the Nepena Valley, there's about 7 of us, and so we know there's an Inca site here, Huacatambo. There's a little bit of Inca here, and then there's a little bit of Inca in the Callejon de Huaylas, but there's there's not a ton. And that's the interesting thing, is that the Inca utilized the Callejón de Huaylas as their kind of highway through to Cajamarca. If you know anything about the Inca, like that's where Atahualpa was when he was captured, was Cajamarca. And so this was kind of like the throughway between the north and the south. So we know they were using this region to kind of travel through, but there wasn't a huge Inca extensive like colonial ownership of it. Does that make sense? Like it's very weird. So there's some tambo stations, so like some trade network stations and roadways, but they were using it for access, but not necessarily using it for the empire. I don't know. You're welcome. Yes.
Do you ever get the sense
Sorry?
do you ever get the sense of people that live there? I realize that's more mystical than science, but do you feel like you're in contact with people while you're digging in your backyards?
Well, I work with the local communities. So the workers who dig with me, they're indigenous. They're from that community.
But I'm wondering if you feel like you're in contact with somehow with ancient people.
Like with spirits.
Well, I don't know that. Yeah, are any ghosts?
I can't say I've felt any ghosts, because I've obviously dug human remains. I've never felt any ghosts while digging through human. There's definitely like a spiritual aura when you're at certain parts of the site, but I've never felt anything while holding like a human skull, if that makes sense. Yes.
So you said that the one mound was like female personified. So I was just curious, how much do we know about how that works as far as how did they decide the site needed the mound there, or was it based off of like a deity that needed a site? You know what I mean? Was it more the site or the deity, which came first, sort of thing?
Yeah. So that's a good question. We don't know for sure. A lot of this oral history has been lost through time. But when the Spanish were getting rid of these religious elements in Peru, they did a lot of like trials while they were missionizing, and so there's historical accounts. And in other regions of Peru, they actually like took records of who the mounds were and the deities were, and a lot of them have origin stories or like legends associated with how they formed, who they were. So there's records of like female mounds and male mounds, and they don't necessarily have to be mounds. Some of them are rock formations, some of them are streams. A lot of them are associated with possibly like something happened in that point, and so that's why they built there. The large mound, Querécoto, was most likely there because it's in this flat pampa, like it's surrounded by agricultural fields. The fact that there are infants there as offerings, and like the way that it's at the headwaters of the river valley, I think that this was most likely like a fertility mound, so which is why there are infants there. So people were coming to give their infants so that they could get water access, kind of like, yeah. So that's one of my theories about because other mound sites like this, they don't have the infants. Like this is one of the, sometimes you'll find like one or two, but to find this many in concentration is pretty unique. And so, yeah. And the different burial styles say that there are different groups of people coming to this place for that purpose. But Joel, did you have a question?
Yeah, what is the elevation at?
It's this is 8,500 feet.
Okay.
This is 3,100 meters. Sorry, so I don't know the maths.
Times 3.
Times 3, yes. So, and then the Inca site is 3,200 meters, and then there's more up there. So,
Did you ever have problems working at that altitude?
it definitely takes a little bit to get acclimated. I usually go up like a week beforehand to kind of and do like light hiking before starting to dig. Yeah.
What will you be working on this summer?
I put in for, I got a grant to go back to Kerakoto, so the larger mound with the infants, but to look at the late pre-ceramic architecture to see if we can. Yes?
At the site where you found the miscarriages, you said that it was their secondary burial. How could you tell?
So secondary burials you can usually tell because they're like bundled burials. So typically that means they're like packaged in a bundle. But most of that stuff has deteriorated away. And so I don't have really great pictures of the burials, but so this is an extended burial. So you can see that it's laid out normally, like laid out flat. So like the person died and you laid them out flat. This is a bundle burial, and that's a bundle burial. So it's kind of wrapped up like in the fetal position. And then, so the way that it's excavated, it's kind of like a jumbled, like there's femurs where humerus should be and heads where toes should be. And it's just kind of like a bundle mess. So you can tell that it was moved there. And it's also usually missing parts and pieces too in the move if things get lost. So, yeah.
Why would they do that?
Why would they do that? Bundle?
Yeah, a reburial.
So there's two reasons. One is if this was a fertility site and there's evidence of feasting, it was probably associated with a specific time of year. So they were coming up to this site at a specific time of year for a festival event or something maybe associated with a solstice, and that's when they were doing this specific rite as community, as a group. So let's say you had an infant that died 6 months beforehand, you would bury it or leave it in a chulpa, in a tomb, and then bring it to this place when it was time with all the other infants. The other reason why is in the Andes, because they do practice ancestor worship, there's typically a year period between death, your first death and your second death. So when you die, you're wet, and then it takes about a year to mummify, and then you're dry. And so like that whole period of time is a transitionary period, and from the wetness to the dryness is like your soul leaving your body. So you're still transitioning. You're not actually dead until you're dry. And so, yeah. So typically, like you're in a first place of burial while you're wet, and then your final burial place is your dry place. Does that make sense? And there's a whole thing like as you become wet, your wetness feeds the earth, which goes into the underworld, and it's like a reciprocal exchange of energy. Oh. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
There were a couple of dogs in the pictures.
Yes.
Local dogs or hired professionals?
They are field assistants. This is Shanku. Shanku was one of our field dogs. He passed away in 2016. Shanku means heart in Quechua. One of my favorites, my favorite field dogs. And then dogs make excellent scales, by the way, so they're really good for photo scales. And this is Ignacio. He's also one of my favorite field dogs. Yeah, Ignacio's still living. He belongs to a boy in town that his name's Clever, and he actually belongs to him, but they let me borrow him when I'm there. Yeah. Any other questions, comments, complaints? Yes.
So earlier in the presentation was the statue that was the inspiration for Indiana Jones. Is there any evidence that they would have done something special, like paint the statues, or would they have just been the bare rock?
That one is just bare rock from what I know. I know that they found like obsidian and jet mirrors, so they know that they were like illuminating him with light while people were underground, but he wasn't painted. Yes?
About how long ago is there early evidence of agriculture and the beginnings of village life? In other words, when did we transition from hunter-gatherer to more settled agriculture?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That's one of these theoretical questions that I've been looking at, like the whole idea of like what came first, the city or the temple? Like, do people congregate first for religious purposes or because they live in a city and agriculture? So that we think that these were semi-sedentary people. We know that by about 8,000 years ago, there's evidence for agriculture, for maize and some peppers that are found in a cave site. And so it was probably more likely horticulture than it was like full domestication. Here at Cosma, I've gotten the phytolith samples done on the floors. So I took soil samples from several different floors from each of these rooms, and we found sweet potato, corn, pea, different kinds of peppers, and manioc. And so we know that at least by 5,000 years ago, there was probably a significant amount of domestication going on there. But it's interesting because the faunal remains in the late pre-ceramic, it's all white-tailed deer. And then by the time the early Horizon come, they had domesticated llama. So like all the deer are replaced by llama remains. So they're no longer hunting deer, they're pastoralists with llamas and alpacas. Yes?
So far, the mounds have always allowed you to dig. What happens if the wind is blowing wrong that day and you're not allowed to? Do you have to take the summer off? Do you have to take...
I think you have to get a better offering and like come...
So you get to ask again?
Yeah. I'd probably come back a few days later with more booze and like jewelry or something. Like, so Pachamama, there's like what she likes to eat, right? So she likes cocoa leaves, she likes tobacco, she likes chocolate, and she likes shiny things. So, and then something that obviously is like significant to you, you have to kind of leave her. So, yeah, you'd come back probably in a week or two and ask again with a better offering. You also have to do that when you find burials. So like you're asking the mound to dig, but then when you find burials, you kind of have to leave offerings for the ancestors as well, and because you're taking them out of their burial place and asking permission and forgiveness.
I didn't know if it was a one-time shot.
No.
Not this summer.
You just up the offering. Yeah. Cool. Well, if no one else has any questions, thank you all for coming, and thanks for coming to the whole series. I think we've put together a good series all semester long, and hopefully this will continue into the fall for everyone who enjoyed it. So, yeah, thank you.